Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today I have a video that has been 1 year in the making, which is my gender identities in adult high fantasy video. This video is a kind of sequel. It's not a kind of sequel, it's a sequel to my sexuality in adult high fantasy video that I uploaded last June. It was also supposed to come out last June, but then I didn't get around to it. I didn't get around to it in the months afterwards. So I decided, you know what, I'm just gonna wait until Pride Month comes around once again. And also there will be a third video, hopefully not with a pause of 1 year in between, in which I will talk about gender identities in adult high fantasy. So before we get into the contents of the video proper, there's a few things I want to have out of the way first. First of all three videos, the sexuality one, the gender identity one, and the gender roles one, are part of my Let's Talk Culture and Fantasy series. That series is a series of videos where I use what I have learned in my bachelor's and master's of cultural and social anthropology to just casually discuss my thoughts on culture, both as it pertains to, you know, worlds within fantasy books, and also just some stuff going on within the fantasy community. And if that sounds interesting to you, the playlist will be linked down below and up there. And also obviously the sexuality and fantasy video is also linked down below and up there. The second thing I wanted to say is that my first video, the sexuality and fantasy video, was scripted, which is actually the only video on my channel that is scripted. I usually don't script videos, however I wanted to have all three of these videos scripted, which I just didn't get around to for this video. I had so much to do in June. I have in general become much more busy than I was last year. So yeah, I just had to decide whether or not I wanted to script this video or whether I wanted to have it be uploaded in June. And I decided it's Pride Month. I wanted to have this video out during Pride Month, but this not being scripted also means that it's gonna be a bit more casual and a bit more off the top of my head than the video last year, even though I have points written down that I want to talk about. And then the third thing I wanted to mention before we get into the contents of this video and what you can expect from this video, and that is that obviously we're going to be talking about gender identities in this video. Because of that, just up front, first of all, biological sex is way more complicated than we learn in high school biology classes. So yeah, even biological sex does not strictly work within a binary. And second of all, gender is a social construct. As such, every single culture and era has had its own construct or concept of what gender is, how many genders there are, etc, etc. Because of that, it is a fact that trans and non-binary identities have existed throughout history, throughout the world, in different cultures, everywhere. And if you have an issue with that, just take your issues somewhere else. And if I see a transphobic or bigoted comment in my comment section, it will be instantly deleted, and I have no tolerance for that. So now that we have all of that out of the way, we can finally get into what you can expect from this video. In this video, what I want to talk about. And in my sexuality and fantasy video, I had two big parts that I talked about. First, I talked about how I think sexuality should be represented within adult high fantasy. And the second thing I talked about was what I want to see more of when it comes to sexuality in adult high fantasy, and what are the dynamics, including sexuality in adult high fantasy, that interests me the most to read about. And with this video, I will mostly stay with the second point and less the first one. I'll get to one of the reasons why I will stay with the first one less, which mostly has to do with gender is a construct. But the second reason why I don't feel as comfortable talking about representation of gender identity is that I am a cisgendered woman. And while I would say that I have quite a good grasp on, you know, how gender identity is discussed both within queer circles as well as within academia, because obviously, first of all, I just educate myself a lot, and then second of all, I have studied anthropology. I still don't feel comfortable talking about this is how gender identity should be represented within adult high fantasy, because obviously with my sexuality in fantasy video, I had the aspect of that I am a bisexual woman. So I had a certain aspect of own voices there where I can say, okay, me as a bisexual woman, this is what I'd like to see. I don't have that when it comes to gender identity. So while there are some things in terms of representation that I want to talk about, you know, I'm just in no way an authority on this subject, so I'm just gonna mention a few things, but I won't linger on it too long, and then I will mostly talk about what I find interesting when it comes to gender identity within adult high fantasy. And so since this intro, I guess, is probably already 10 minutes long, let's finally get into the video, and let's start with the thing that I said I don't want to talk about too long, and that is representation in adult high fantasy. And here I just, you know, maybe I should say I have a few questions, or, you know, open-ended discussion points that maybe end in a little bit of a question. And that is that something that I find very interesting is, and I'll get to that more later on, is that adult high fantasy opens so many options when it comes to gender identity, because obviously we live in a magic-less world. You know, we are, you know, we have science, we have humans, we do have a lot of species of animals on our planet. We have a lot of animals on our planet that spontaneously change their sex also. We have organisms on our planet that don't work with sexual reproduction, etc, etc. And so while we have a big diversity there, obviously when it comes to humans, we are rather limited. I mean, generally speaking, as I said, while biological sex is not a binary as we are taught in high school biology class, most people do fall into the binary, and then we also have intersex persons. But while we do now have different options when it comes to changing your gender identity, be it hormone replacement therapy, different surgeries, or just socially transitioning, you know, I would say we're still rather limited, and a lot of those options require a lot of effort. However, that completely changes when you introduce magic to a world, where just options become a lot more broad, and then also, which also changes when you add different fantastical or science fiction-y races to the picture. I am mostly going to be talking about adult high fantasy. However, I have an example later on I want to talk about which includes science fiction, so I'm just, you know, a lot of what I'm saying, while it is mostly about adult high fantasy, might also work for science fiction. And so the question I have, I guess, if there are any trans people or any non-binary people watching, is how much do you identify with those characters that maybe are trans, but, you know, their transition is a lot different from how transitioning would work within our world. Or if you're non-binary, but the concept of what non-binary means is something completely different within the fantasy world than it is within our social constructs. So yeah, that's just something that I wanted to ask, how you deal with the representation of a lot of trans characters or a lot of queer characters, genderqueer characters within fantasy that, you know, don't necessarily fit with our image of what gender queerness is. Do you still feel like it represents you, and do you still feel like it represents gender queerness? Which is something where I'm also like, a lot of the trans characters, I would say, that I read about, I'm not necessarily sure if I would call them representation. For example, over here in Gen Lions, A Chorus of Dragons, there is a character who, I don't know, I guess you could say she's trans, but then maybe not, but maybe she's non-binary. It's just very difficult to say if she represents any common concept within our world of a genderqueer person, because it's just that the context of the culture she comes from is so very specific that it just makes it really hard. Because within her culture, you have, you know, biological sex, I guess. You know, she calls herself female. She says she is female. However, socially, she is a man. But she has no interest in transitioning or anything, but at the same time she has a friend who was born as biologically male and who then magically transitioned because she was socially a woman, and because she just wanted to transition, she also transitioned her body, and now she is biologically female. And in those cases, it just, you know, it's something that interests me whether or not that would be considered representation, because it is gender queerness, I would say, but because of the magic included in the world and because of the very specific contexts of those cultures that are those contexts, because there is magic, it just makes it unlike anything that you'd have, or not unlike anything, but unlike the most common concepts of genderqueerness that we have today within our world. And then another example from the same series actually is that you have an entire genderqueer race that is like clownfish actually, because that's where the inspiration came from, where all people start out as men, and then at some point in their life, I don't remember if it was spontaneously or if it was, you know, at a specific point in their life, they transition to be women. And then all of them become women at one point. But then we also do have one character who belongs to a similar race that has the same thing, that openly think about, hey, actually, yeah, I could at one point in my life transition to be a woman, but I actually have no interest in doing that. And so when it comes to examples like this, like, do you consider that representation or not? And yeah, it's just something that interests me personally. On the other hand, something that I can say that maybe authors should try not to do when it comes to gender identity and representation is solely having representation within their non-human, i.e. alien races, or just strange races, and especially using those races and the gender queerness of those races to enforce the cis-binary within the human race. Which, sorry, but I gotta drag Brandon Sanderson for a bit, and he has to serve as an example for that, because he actually did it twice, where he did it like very aggressively, I would say, and then maybe he even did it a third time, which, let's start with the third time, which was the Kendra, where, you know, the one time he goes like, maybe there's some gender queerness going on, it's the fucking blob monsters, obviously. Then there is one time within the Skyward series, which is what my science fiction example is about, where he has an alien race that does not reproduce via sexual reproduction. As such, there aren't really any men or women within that species or within that race, but everyone is kind of non-binary, I guess. Although, can you even call it non-binary if there isn't a binary in the first place? And it's just the way all the human characters react to that, and the way also a lot of those aliens talk about their gender to the humans in a way where it's like, yeah, you just don't know what's going on, and you just don't have a concept of like anyone being not a man or a woman or whatever, just really reinforces the binary within the humans of that world, which is iffy. And, you know, I don't think it's necessarily anything bad to have aliens or non-human races that don't work within a binary or that work completely different from humans, because I also actually just think it's lazy world building if every single race is just, you know, very humanoid and very binary and whatever. Like, what makes you think that completely different life forms would work the same way humans do? And so, you know, it's not necessarily something bad if you have non-binary aliens, but if that is your one representation, and if all of your non-binary representation, or all representation that isn't cis-binary, is consistently the non-human beings in your worlds, then that's just a little bit iffy. And then the tip of the iceberg, the creme de la creme, is just the Stormlight Archive series, where there's these beings called Spren, which are basically manifested ideas. I don't know how else to explain it. It's probably a very wrong explanation, and I'm gonna get some fans in my comments telling me how I'm wrong to explain Spren like that, but I do not care. Anyway, they're basically manifested ideas, and you have this scene between a Spren and one of our main characters where they talk, and the Spren tells the main character that among Spren there's 4 genders. And our main character is very surprised by that, to which the Spren says, "Oh silly, of course there's more than 2 genders. Not all the ideas that manifested us were human." You know, once again cementing that humans only have the binary among them, which it's just, you know, if you had said that not all of the ideas that manifested us were X culture, then at least you could say, okay, this very Christian style culture, obviously they're gonna have a binary. But yeah, it's just, anyway, this is how to not do representation in my opinion. But in terms of doing representation, as I said, I just have a very hard time saying what exactly of genderqueerness within adult high fantasy is representation, would be considered representation, what would genderqueer individuals feel represented by, but I just think there's so many options there. And that is now where I will transition to talking about what do I want from genderqueerness within adult high fantasy. So with this one, it's quite similar to what I already talked about with sexuality in fantasy, and that is that I just want authors to realize all the options that are there. And first of all, obviously, especially if you're a genderqueer author, there is nothing wrong, and I would 100% encourage you to write your own experience into fantasy books. Also, actually, let me just reiterate one point from my sexuality in fantasy video. I mean, obviously, I don't have the genderqueer experience, so I can't say how much it really fits with that. But once again, I just think writing queer people within fantasy is way easier than writing queer people outside of fantasy. Because a lot of the things that make writing queer people so hard is that we have very specific experiences that a lot of times don't necessarily have to do with our identity, but with how our identity interacts with the world and the bigotry that we meet because of that. However, you can write a world where bigotry does not exist within adult high fantasy. That is not to say that I think cis-het authors should go out there and write proud and queer main characters into their books, but I do think that if you put the research in that so many fantasy authors put in when it comes to weapons or whatever, and if you talk to queer people, if you talk to non-binary people, if you talk to trans people, if you use sensitivity readers, not just one, but multiple sensitivity readers, I think it is possible to write even major side characters and some smaller main characters that are queer into your fantasy worlds, and to write them into those worlds very, very well and have them be great representation. So yeah, that was just the last thing that I wanted to say when it comes to representation. Now, what do I want from the queer content within my fantasy books? As I said, once again, I just want all the options explored. I just want what I had in A Chorus of Dragons, which is part of the reason why I love it so much, where you have magic, where you have new races, where it's like, yeah, obviously it's not gonna be like it is in our world. Obviously there is magic where you can just easily transition from one gender to another. Obviously there's races that just work completely differently biologically from us. And those are the things that interest me. The times when I'm most excited coming across queerness or coming across gender identities is when I can say, I can see how this works. I can see how this works very specifically because of this specific culture. Not because it's taken from any specific example within our world, which obviously, once again, if you are a queer author, if you're a genderqueer author, and you want to write characters where you can see yourself in them, all power to you. That is also something that I want. I love seeing queer authors write the worlds that they always wanted to write. But then on the other hand, as I said, I also just sometimes want queer identities where I'm like, is this representation or is this not representation? It's queer, it's like unapologetically queer, but it's not something that you would ever see within our world because it's just, as I said, a different cultural context. And that is also why a lot of times, while I do very much enjoy encountering, you know, concepts of queerness and concepts of gender queerness that, you know, come from outside of the Western concept that we even today have of what gender queerness is, that come from a lot of concepts of gender that pre-colonial cultures had. While I do love coming across those concepts and celebrate them, especially when they were written by marginalized authors, I also just really love coming across concepts that don't really have a real life example that sits across from them, I would say, where I nevertheless see that the authors studied a lot of different cultures and a lot of different concepts, but they didn't really take one specific example that they modeled the culture in the fantasy world after, or at least none that I would be familiar with. Obviously there's always the option that I just don't know about it, but an example for that is Marie Brennan in the Lady Trans series. No, that's not the Lady Trans series. The Lady Trans series is over there, you can't see it. So in the Lady Trans series, in the 4th book, you have a concept of non-binary characters that I don't think is one specific culture, but it's very similar to a lot of different concepts of non-binariness in different cultures that I've come across in my anthropology studies, which honestly doesn't surprise me because Marie Brennan, as I always mention, is herself an anthropologist, or was an anthropologist. And so that's just the first part of what I really enjoy coming across in adult high fantasy when it comes to queerness or gender queerness. Just, you know, authors celebrating their identity, obviously, first of all, authors rediscovering their culture, second of all, and then just gender concepts where I'm like, yeah, you work within the concept of the culture that was created within this world, and it's just beautiful and I love it. And then the last thing I wanted to say that I also enjoy a lot of the times, which is something that a lot of people also don't enjoy, is culture crashes, I guess. I don't know how else to put it. So there's a lot of women who don't enjoy reading misogyny in books. There's a lot of trans people who don't enjoy reading transphobia in books. There's a lot of queer people who don't enjoy reading queerphobia in books. And I do think that is very fair, and for me it also very much depends on the context of the book and how it is dealt with within the book. However, something I always find very interesting is how the specific context of a book changes the perception of queerness of the people within the book, which does not necessarily always have to mean that, you know, everything is happy and queerphobia does not exist, transphobia doesn't exist, etc. For example, you can see it up here, in the Black Coast, you have very different cultures with very different gender concepts. And you have one culture that is completely open to a lot of different genders. I think they have a total of 6 or 7. So they have high masculine, low masculine, true neutral, low feminine, high feminine, and then they have like agender, kind of. And while one culture does have that, another culture doesn't have that and only recognizes the binary. And I think a lot of times the dynamics that come from different cultures coming together with different gender concepts is something that's just very interesting to me if a book is well written. And the same obviously also goes for magic. If you have magic, tell me exactly how that influences gender. Like, you can't just say it doesn't do anything with gender. If magic can heal, obviously it can change the body. So what does that mean for transgender individuals? Does that mean they're especially accepted? Does that not change anything at all? Etc, etc. If it's normal that transgender people exist, that maybe because of magic they can fully transition in a way that they wouldn't be able to within our world, what does that do with lineage systems? What does that do with who becomes heir of what, etc, etc. So those are the things that I want to see within adult high fantasy more, and those are the things that I a lot of times think are not included enough still, and that's just because, you know, one of my biggest pet peeves with an adult high fantasy is how, you know, a lot of times the cultural aspects, the social aspects are just very much ignored when it comes to world building. And so going forward, I just hope we get to see more of that. And I do think, especially those things, when it comes to social and cultural things, those are the things that you can include even as a cis author very easily, because it's not about writing a specific experience, it's just about building a world. And obviously you have to be careful because, you know, transphobia is a bitch, and a lot of times, even if you write something in a fictional world, you can still perpetuate harm within our world. So it's not like you can just do it and it's easy and whatever. But I do think that it's easier than writing, you know, or putting yourself under the pressure, I guess, of writing a specific experience. So yeah, I think that was all the thoughts I had to gender and adult high fantasy. This is a very long video already. I will try to cut it down to, maybe I'll manage 30 minutes, who knows. But anyway, as always, I encourage you to discuss your thoughts with me, especially if you yourself identify as either transgender or non-binary or agender, or, you know, any genderqueer identity. I would especially once again encourage you to share your views on how you see representation within adult high fantasy. And so yes, with all of that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media and also once again to the playlist and to last year's video will be linked down below. Also all the links to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where I read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman or genderqueer person per month. And with all of that said, I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!